trying to solve the ultimate puzzle, how to live a perfect life. एक ऐसा ब्लूप्रिंट जो कहता है here's how you balance your career, your desires, your duties और आपके spiritual goals.
Right.
लेकिन what if the same society that created this beautiful blueprint उसने ही दुनिया का सबसे rigid और unequal social hierarchy भी बनाया हो?
यही तो है द ग्रेट इंडियन पैराडॉक्स।
हम इस सब में एक गहरी चर्चा करेंगे, बट फर्स्ट एक छोटा सा काम, जल्दी से सब्सक्राइब बटन दबा दो, लाइक करो और नोटिफिकेशन बेल ऑन कर लो ताकि आप ऐसी कोई भी अमेजिंग डिस्कशन मिस ना करो।
एग्जैक्टली और आज हम इसी पैराडॉक्स को एक्सप्लोर करेंगे। हाउ कैन अ सिस्टम बी सो फिलोसॉफिकल एंड येट सो स्ट्रक्चर्ड? कभी-कभी तो एट अ फॉल्ट। We look at the foundational pillars that shaped this society for thousands of years.
बिल्कुल। So here's our learning map for today's deep dive.
Okay?
First, we'll unpack the traditional basis of the Indian social system. इसमें हम बात करेंगे concepts like पुरुषार्था, the आश्रमा system और कर्मा की।
Got it.
Then we'll get into the caste system and social stratification. इसमें वर्णा and जाति models और इसका real world impact on scheduled castes and OBCs सब डिस्कस होगा।
काफी डिटेल्ड होने वाला है।
And finally, we'll see the impact of other major religions जैसे Jainism, Buddhism, Islam and Christianity on this complex social fabric. चलो शुरू करते हैं।
Let's do it.
भाग 1, भारतीय सामाजिक व्यवस्था के पारंपरिक आधार, ट्रेडिशनल बेसिस ऑफ इंडियन सोशल सिस्टम।
Okay.
टॉपिक 1, पुरुषार्था।
Right.
ब्रॉड माइक्रो थीम, द 4 एम्स ऑफ लाइफ। पुरुषार्था, द ब्लूप्रिंट फॉर अ मीनिंगफुल लाइफ। सो लेट्स स्टार्ट विद पुरुषार्था। ये बेसिकली हिंदू फिलॉसफी के वो 4 लेजिटिमेट गोल्स हैं जो एक इंसान की लाइफ को गाइड करते हैं।
और इसकी ब्यूटी ये है कि इट्स नॉट अबाउट चूजिंग वन, इट्स अबाउट बैलेंसिंग ऑल 4, है ना?
एग्जैक्टली, बैलेंस इज द की।
थिंक ऑफ इट लाइक दिस, एक स्टूडेंट का अभी धर्मा है टू स्टडी वेल, फिर वो जॉब करेगा टू अर्न अर्था यानी वेल्थ।
राइट।
अपनी फैमिली की नीड्स और डिजायर्स को पूरा करने के लिए ही विल परस्यू कामा, और एंड में आफ्टर फुलफिलिंग ऑल दीज ड्यूटीज वो स्पिरिचुअल पीस या मोक्ष की तरफ बढ़ेगा।
मतलब इट्स अ कंप्लीट लाइफ पोर्टफोलियो, नॉट जस्ट अ सिंगल इन्वेस्टमेंट।
परफेक्ट एनालॉजी।
तो चलो लेट्स अनपैक दिस। द सोर्सेस से पुरुषार्था को त्रिवर्गा और आखिरी गोल मोक्ष में डिवाइड किया गया है। ये कैसे काम करता है?
देखिए, ये कॉन्सेप्ट्स हजारों साल पुराने हैं। द रियल जीनियस हियर वाज डिजाइनिंग अ सिस्टम टू हार्मोनाइज सोसाइटी। ऐसा सिस्टम जहां इंडिविजुअल डिजायर्स और सोशल रिस्पांसिबिलिटीज में कॉन्फ्लिक्ट ना हो।
बैलेंस, बार बार यही वर्ड आ रहा है।
बिकॉज दैट वाज द की वर्ड ऑलवेज।
सो लेट्स ब्रेक डाउन द 4 पार्ट्स। पहला है धर्मा। द रूट वर्ड ध्र का मतलब है टू अपहोल्ड। सो धर्मा इज व्हाट अपहोल्ड्स सोसाइटी एंड द इंडिविजुअल, योर ड्यूटीज, योर राइचियसनेस।
एकदम सही, ये एथिकल फाउंडेशन है।
नेक्स्ट इज अर्था।
हाँ, अर्था यानी वर्ल्डली प्रॉस्पेरिटी, वेल्थ, पावर, सिक्योरिटी। लेकिन यहाँ एक कैच है, अर्था मस्ट बी गवर्न्ड बाय धर्मा।
अच्छा, मतलब आप वेल्थ अर्न करो बट राइचियसली।
बिल्कुल। इसके 3 एस्पेक्ट्स हैं, एक्विजिशन, अपरिग्रह यानी नॉन अप्रोप्रिएशन, एंड अस्तेय यानी नॉन स्टीलिंग। सो वेल्थ इज अ मीन्स टू एन एंड, नॉट द एंड इटसेल्फ। समझे?
गॉट इट। फिर आता है कामा यानी डिजायर। एंड दिस इजंट जस्ट अबाउट फिजिकल प्लेजर जैसा लोग सोचते हैं।
नहीं, बिल्कुल नहीं। इट इंक्लूड्स एस्थेटिक सेटिस्फैक्शन फ्रॉम आर्ट, म्यूजिक और फैमिली लीनिएज यानी कुला को कंटिन्यू करने की डिजायर। इट रिकॉग्नाइजेस ह्यूमन डिजायर्स एज नेचुरल एंड इंपॉर्टेंट।
और आखिर में है मोक्षा, द अल्टीमेट गोल, लिबरेशन फ्रॉम द साइकिल ऑफ बर्थ एंड डेथ।
Yes, ये अल्टीमेट सेल्फ रियलाइजेशन है, द अंडरस्टैंडिंग दैट योर इंडिविजुअल सेल्फ इज वन विद द यूनिवर्सल कॉन्शियसनेस, अहम ब्रह्मास्मि।
द रियल वर्ल्ड इम्पैक्ट ऑफ दिस फ्रेमवर्क इज ह्यूज। ये एक एंशिएंट आंसर है टू मॉडर्न बर्नआउट।
सही बात है।
In a world obsessed with artha, yani career, and kama, yani pleasure, it forces us to ask about our dharma, our purpose, and moksha, our inner peace.
बिल्कुल। In short, dharma, artha and kama are the 3 varga that regulate worldly life. They are for this world. And moksha is the ultimate spiritual destination.
A complete package for a fulfilled life.
Exactly.
Okay, here's a question. एक मिनट, अगर किसी को आते ही सिर्फ मोक्षा चाहिए, can they just skip artha and kama?
Question. Traditionally, no. System sequential है. It says you must go through the grihastha ashrama, the householder stage, जहां अर्थ और कामा को धर्म के अंदर फुलफिल करना ही आपकी प्राइमरी ड्यूटी है।
अच्छा, तो डायरेक्ट जंप टू मोक्षा को एक तरह से इररिस्पांसिबिलिटी माना जाता था।
हाँ, it was seen as escaping your social responsibilities.
But what if someone's dharma conflicts with their kama? जैसे एक सोल्जर का धर्मा है टू फाइट, but his kama is to live peacefully.
यही तो इसका कोर लॉजिक है। धर्म इज द रेगुलेटरी फोर्स, वो हमेशा अर्था और कामा से ऊपर रहेगा। सो इन दैट आइडियल फ्रेमवर्क, द सोल्जर्स ड्यूटी टू द नेशन ओवररूल्स हिज पर्सनल डिजायर फॉर पीस। धर्म इज द कंपस।
Got it. और अर्था सिर्फ मनी है या पावर और इन्फ्लुएंस भी इसमें आते हैं?
बिल्कुल आते हैं। अर्था इज अबाउट ऑल काइंड्स ऑफ वर्ल्डली प्रोस्पेरिटी, वेल्थ, सोशल स्टैंडिंग, इन्फ्लुएंस, बट द रूल रिमेन्स द सेम। इट मस्ट बी परस्यूड एथिकली विद इन द फ्रेमवर्क ऑफ धर्मा।
So for modern life, how can we apply पुरुषार्था? क्या ये अब भी रेलेवेंट है?
I think it's more relevant than ever. It's about creating a balanced scorecard for your life. अपने करियर अर्था को ऑनेस्टली परस्यू करो, अपनी हॉबीज और फैमिली कामा को टाइम दो, अपनी सोशल एंड मॉरल रिस्पॉन्सिबिलिटीज धर्मा को मत भूलो, और इस सब के बीच फाइंड टाइम फॉर मेंटल एंड स्पिरिचुअल पीस, मोक्षा।
And moksha doesn't necessarily mean becoming a hermit and leaving the world, मतलब सन्यासी बन जाना।
Not at all. मोक्षा एक स्टेट ऑफ माइंड है। द गीता ब्यूटिफुली एक्सप्लेन्स दैट अ कर्म योगी जो अपने सारी ड्यूटीज बिना अटैचमेंट के करता है, वो एक ट्रू सन्यासी है। You can achieve liberation while living a full, active life in the world.
Cool, na? Now pause in practice, seeing the four purusharthas: dharma, artha, kama, moksha.
In short, Purushartha provides a fourfold framework to build a balanced life portfolio, integrating worldly duties with the ultimate spiritual goal.
Cha.
Topic 2. Ashrama. Broad micro theme. The 4 stages of life.
Let's get into it.
Ashrama. Life's 4 stages. So, if Purushartha is the what, then the ashrama system is the when. It's a roadmap for your entire life, ideally divided into 4 stages, each with its own duties.
It's like a cosmic education system, hai na?
Haan, Brahmacharya is your school and college life, where you just learn. Grahastha is your professional and family life, where you apply knowledge and take on responsibility.
Acha.
Vanaprastha is like your mentorship phase or retirement, where you guide the next generation. And sannyasa is the final spiritual journey, focused completely on liberation.
So the ashrama system is the practical application of the Purushartha theory. Chalo, इन stages को detail में देखते हैं.
Yes, the system was designed to ensure an individual fulfills all personal and social responsibilities in a structured way before seeking moksha. ये chaos को prevent करता है.
पहला stage है ब्रह्मचार्य आश्रमा, the student stage. ये उपनयन संस्कार से शुरू होता है.
हाँ, it's a period of discipline, learning from a guru और artha and kama के distraction से दूर रहना. Basically future के लिए preparation.
फिर आता है गृहस्था आश्रमा, the householder stage. ये विवाह या marriage से शुरू होता है. And it's considered the most critical stage.
बिल्कुल critical. यहाँ पर you actively pursue dharma, artha and kama. You have to repay the 3 rinas or debts, support your family और basically society का engine चलाना है. बाकी सब आश्रमास इस stage पर ही dependent है.
Next is vanaprasthashrama, the retirement stage.
ये एक slow withdrawal है. You hand over household responsibilities to the next generation and dedicate more time to spiritual pursuits. Traditionally, लोग forest में retire हो जाते थे.
Interesting. और final stage है sannyasa ashrama, the stage of renunciation.
यहाँ एक person gives up all worldly attachments to focus solely on attaining moksha. Interestingly, Kautilya suggested punishment for those who took sannyasa without fulfilling their family responsibilities first.
That's fascinating. So even spiritual goals had to wait for social duties. Although आजकल कोई forest नहीं जाता, the concept still exists, right?
Of course.
लोग एक एक्टिव करियर गृहस्था के बाद रिटायर होते हैं वनाप्रस्था और फिर सोशल वर्क या स्पिरिचुअल एक्टिविटीज में लग जाते हैं. A modern sannyasa.
Precisely. The ashrama system ensures a person contributes to society and fulfills personal goals in a sequential, organized way. It structures life so you don't have to do everything at once.
But I have to ask, ये काफी idealistic लगता है. In modern times, how should we look at the brahmacharya ashrama? क्या ये सिर्फ हमारी स्कूल कॉलेज लाइफ है?
Yes, absolutely. It represents that phase of life dedicated to focused learning and skill development before you enter the workforce. The core principles of discipline and focus are still incredibly relevant for any student today.
And गृहस्थ आश्रमा को most critically important क्यों कहा गया है?
Because it's the pillar that holds up the entire society. सोचो ना, हाउसहोल्डर्स ही हैं जो वेल्थ अर्न करते हैं, नेक्स्ट जनरेशन को क्रिएट करते हैं और स्टूडेंट्स को ब्रह्मचार्य एंड एल्डर्स को वानप्रस्था संन्यासा को सपोर्ट करते हैं. उनके बिना द होल सोशल सिस्टम वुड कोलैप्स. दे आर द प्रोड्यूसर्स.
Kautilya suggesting punishment for early sannyasis. ये अभी भी अजीब लगता है for a spiritual system.
कौटिल्य एक pragmatist थे. For him, social order and duty, dharma was supreme. अगर लोग अपनी फैमिली ड्यूटीज को पूरा किए बिना सन्यासी बनने लगेंगे, सोसाइटी का स्ट्रक्चर वीक हो जाएगा. It was a measure to prevent social irresponsibility disguised as spirituality.
Okay, a big question. Was this ashrama system the same for women?
Traditionally, the formal framework was described primarily for men, especially the Dvija or twice-born castes. However, women played an absolutely crucial role, especially in the Grihastha ashram, as the backbone of the family. उनका धर्म उस कॉन्टेक्स्ट में डिफाइन किया गया था as managers of the household and preservers of tradition.
And what's the main difference between vanaprastha and sannyasa? दोनों में detachment है ना?
Great point. Think of Vanaprastha as a transition period, एक semi-retirement. You are slowly withdrawing, perhaps acting as an advisor to your family. You are still socially connected. Sannyasa is complete renunciation. All social ties are formally broken in the single-minded pursuit of moksha.
Okay, pause and try to explain the 4 ashramas in one line each, practicing this.
In short, the ashram system divides life into 4 stages: learning, building, guiding, and renouncing, to give it a clear structure and purpose. Topic 3. Rina. Broad microtheme, the debts of life.
This one is very interesting.
Rina, the 3 debts everyone is born with. Now for a super interesting concept. Rina. Yani, the idea that every person is born with certain debts they must repay. ये एक cosmic balance sheet जैसा है.
Exactly. And this isn't a financial debt. ये एक social or spiritual obligation है. The philosophy is that we receive so much from the universe, our ancestors and our teachers, कि हमारी duty है to give back. Fulfilling these rinas is considered essential for moksha.
So what are these debts? Let's break them down.
The first is Deva Rina, the debt to the gods or divine forces. ये repay होता है through worship, performing rituals या yagnas. It's about acknowledging the cosmic forces that sustain the universe and showing gratitude.
Next up is Rishi Rina, The debts to the sages and gurus. हाँ, ये वो लोग हैं जिन्होंने knowledge create किया और आगे बढ़ाया. We repay this by studying scriptures, preserving that knowledge and passing it on. अपने teachers को respect करना is also a part of it.
And then comes Pitra Rina, the debt to our parents and ancestors. They gave us life.
Traditionally, this was repaid by continuing the family lineage, having children. It also includes performing rituals for the ancestors.
The source also mentions an Atithi Rina, a debt to guests. This is fascinating.
Huh, it's not just about being hospitable. It represents our debt to society at large.
This system created a powerful sense of social responsibility. It wasn't just about me and my desires. It was about my duties to the cosmos, to knowledge, to my family, and to my community.
It instills humility.
How does this concept of Rina connect to the Grihastha Ashrama we just discussed?
The Grihastha Ashrama is the primary stage for repaying these debts. As a householder, you perform rituals, Devarina, raise a family, Pitrarina, and support the learned and the community, Rishi and Atithirina. This is another reason why the householder stage is so crucial.
But in modern times, how can we interpret Rishi Rina? Most people don't have a traditional guru.
Think of it as a debt to all of human knowledge. Repaying it could mean supporting education, contributing to science or art, or simply being a lifelong learner and sharing what you know. It's about valuing and perpetuating the intellectual heritage of humanity.
And what about Pitra Rina? Is it only about having children? What about people who choose not to or cannot?
While progeny was the traditional interpretation, modern interpretations are broader. It can also mean caring for your parents in their old age, honoring your family's legacy through good deeds, and contributing positively to the world in their name.
What happens if someone doesn't repay these debts, according to the philosophy?
Failing to repay the rinas is said to create negative karma. It leaves your spiritual balance sheet in the red, and this can be an obstacle to achieving moksha. You are not free until your obligations are met.
So these debts are essentially a moral compass for a person's life.
Precisely. They provide a framework of duties that guides a person's actions. It shifts the perspective from what can I get from the world to what must I give back. It's a philosophy of contribution, not consumption.
Okay, practicing the three main rinas. Deva Rina, Rishi Rina, Pita Rina. Pure individualism.
Topic 4. Karma.
The big one.
Broad micro theme.
The law of action and consequence.
Hmm.
Karma. You get what you give. Okay, let's talk about a word everyone thinks they know. Karma. It's not just what goes around comes around. It's much deeper, almost like a law of spiritual physics.
That's a great way to put it. Karma literally means action, but it implies the entire cycle of action and its consequences. The core principle is causal efficacy. Every action, thought, and intention creates an effect. Good actions produce good effects, bad actions produce bad ones. Simple, but profound.
And here's the kicker. The source says a person's present condition is the result of deeds from both this life and past lives. ये कर्मा को rebirth से directly connect करता है.
Exactly. This isn't about some external god judging you. Modern interpreters see karma as a rational concept that encourages morality. The deep insight is that it gives you agency. You are the architect of your own destiny. Your present actions are shaping your future.
And then there's that famous line from the Bhagavad Gita. Karmanyavadikaraste.
You have a right to the action alone, never to its fruits. That's a very powerful idea about detachment.
It's a psychological masterstroke.
Yes. It teaches you to focus on doing your duty, dharma, with 100% effort, without being emotionally attached to the outcome. This frees you from the anxiety of success or failure. This is the path of the karma yogi.
But इसका misinterpretation भी हो सकता है, right? If someone is suffering, is it just their bad karma? Doesn't that justify inaction or social inequality?
Of the idea. The empowering interpretation is that while past karma may have created your starting point, your present karma, your free will and actions right now, has the power to change your entire future.
इस कर्मा एक individual concept या group या collective karma जैसा भी कुछ होता है?
While the primary focus is individual, some philosophies do discuss collective karma for families, communities, or nations. The idea is that the collective actions of a group shape its collective destiny.
So, can you cancel out bad karma with good karma?
It's like cancellation, and more like a cosmic balance sheet. Good actions add positive credits that can mitigate the effects of past negative actions.
Mitigate.
But the ultimate goal is to act without attachment, which creates no new karma at all, good or bad. That's how you break the cycle.
Wait, the goal is to have zero karma, not just good karma.
Exactly. Both good and bad karma bind you to the cycle of rebirth. Good karma might get you a better life next time, but you're still in the game. The goal of moksha is to get out of the game altogether. This is achieved by acting without personal desire for the fruits of the action.
So, what's the difference between karma and simple cause and effect?
Karma adds a crucial moral and metaphysical dimension. It's not just physical action-reaction. The intent behind the action matters immensely. An accidental harm is different from a malicious one. Karma is an ethical law, not just a physical one.
Let's practice. Try to explain the core idea of karma in one sentence. Practice saying it.
In short, karma is the universal law of moral cause and effect where your actions and intentions across lifetimes continuously shape your destiny.
Topic 5. Punarjan. Rebirth.
the other half of karma.
Broad micro theme, the cycle of life.
Hmm.
Punarjan, the soul's journey. Okay, this ties in perfectly with karma. Punarjan, or rebirth, is the other half of the equation. It's the stage on which the drama of karma plays out.
Yes, the two concepts are inseparable. Punarjan is built on the belief that the Atma, the soul, is immortal. When the physical body dies, the soul doesn't. It's like a driver getting out of a broken down car.
And then the driver finds a new car.
Precisely. The soul undergoes transmigration. It moves from one body to another, carrying its accumulated karma with it. This cycle of birth, death, and rebirth continues until the soul finally achieves moksha.
So moksha is the final destination where the journey ends.
Yes, moksha is the ultimate liberation from this relentless cycle. It's the moment the individual soul, Atma, realizes its true nature and merges with the universal soul, Paramatma. The journey is finally over. The driver reaches home.
What's the social function of this belief? ये इतना central क्यों था?
It has a powerful deterring effect. The belief that you will be reborn and that your next life will be determined by your actions in this one encourages people to live in accordance with dharma. It forces you to think long-term beyond just one lifetime.
So if I live a good life now, I might be reborn into a better situation, better family, better health, better opportunities.
That's the core idea. Your karma is like your cosmic resume, and it determines the circumstances of your next birth.
But क्या soul अपनी past lives को याद रखता है? It would be so much easier if we remembered our mistakes.
Generally, no. With each new birth, the conscious memory is wiped clean. It's a fresh start. However, some spiritual traditions believe that highly advanced yogis can recall their past existences.
Okay, so the ultimate goal isn't just to get a better rebirth, but to break out of the cycle entirely.
Exactly. A better rebirth is still a temporary reward. You are still trapped in the world of suffering, old age, and death. The ultimate goal is moksha, which is permanent liberation from the cycle itself. It's the difference between getting a better prison cell and getting out of prison altogether.
How is this different from the idea of heaven in other religions?
Heaven is often seen as a final place of reward after one life. Moksha is not a place, but a state of being. A state of ultimate reality and union with the divine, achieved after potentially many, many lives. It's the end of the journey, not just a pleasant stopover.
And what happens to your karma when you attain moksha?
When a soul achieves moksha, all its accumulated karma is said to be exhausted or dissolved. It is no longer subject to the law of karma. It is free.
How does this belief affect one's view of death?
It can make death seem less final and terrifying. It's seen as a transition, like changing old clothes for new ones, rather than a full stop. The soul's journey continues.
Okay, let's practice this. In your own words, try to explain the relationship between karma, punarjan, and moksha. Practice saying it.
In short, Punarjanam is the doctrine that the immortal soul is reborn repeatedly, with each new life shaped by past karma, until it finally achieves moksha, or permanent liberation from the cycle.
Topic 6, joint family.
Right, the social unit.
Broad micro theme, the social and economic unit.
Mhm.
The joint family, society's safety net. Okay, we've talked about the individual's philosophical journey, but in India, that journey was never undertaken alone. The fundamental vehicle for this journey was the joint family.
A joint family isn't just a big family. It's a specific corporate structure. Typically, 3 or more generations living under one roof, sharing a common kitchen, holding property in common, and functioning as a single economic unit.
And there's a CEO, right? The karta.
Who acts as the manager or trustee. He holds authority and manages the family's affairs and property for the collective benefit of all members.
The philosophy behind it is we before me. It suppresses individualistic motives in favor of the family's collective interest. The source says work is distributed by capacity and benefits are disbursed by need.
The source calls it a form of social insurance, and that's the key insight. It was a powerful pre-modern welfare state. If you were old, sick, disabled, or unemployed, the joint family took care of you. No one was abandoned.
But this traditional structure has been breaking down. What happened?
A few major things. The source points to Western education, which introduced values of individualism. But the biggest factor was industrialization and urbanization. People had to move to cities for jobs, physically breaking up the single household.
So is the joint family completely gone?
The classical large joint family under one roof is rare now, especially in cities. But the spirit of the joint family, strong kinship ties, mutual support, a sense of collective responsibility, is still very strong in Indian culture, even if family members live separately.
What were the main advantages of this system?
Besides the incredible social security, it ensured division of labor, economic efficiency in agriculture, and was a powerful engine for transmitting culture, values, and skills from one generation to the next.
But there must have been disadvantages. It sounds like it could be suffocating.
Absolutely. It could stifle individual ambition and personal freedom. Lack of privacy was a huge issue. The Karta's authority could become oppressive, and it often led to internal conflicts, especially among the women of the household.
How did it impact women's roles?
Women were the backbone of the household, managing everything internally. However, their position was often subordinate. Their autonomy was limited, and their lives were largely defined by their roles as wives, daughters-in-law, and mothers within that collective structure.
So it's a trade-off. We've lost the built-in support system for childcare and elder care, but we've gained individual freedom and privacy.
That's a very good way to put it. The shift from joint to nuclear families reflects a broader societal shift in values, from community first to individual first. There are gains and losses on both sides.
Let's practice. Try to list 3 key features of a traditional joint family. Practice saying them.
In short, the joint family was a multi-generational socio-economic unit based on shared property and collective interest, acting as society's original safety net.
भाग 2 जाति व्यवस्था और सामाजिक स्तरीकरण.
Okay, the tone shifts a bit here.
Topic 7 caste system.
Right.
Broad micro theme, the hierarchical social structure. The caste system, Varna and Jati.
Okay, now we move to one of the most complex and controversial features of Indian society, the caste system. The word caste itself comes from the Portuguese word casta, meaning race or lineage.
It's a system of social stratification, defined by a few key features. It's hierarchical. The groups are closed, so you can't move between them. They are endogamous, which means you marry within your group. And most importantly, membership is determined by birth. Let's use an analogy. The ideal blueprint is the Varna model. Imagine society as a building with 4 floors. On top are the Brahmins, priests and scholars, then Kshatriyas, warriors and rulers, then Vaishyas, merchants and farmers, and finally Shudras, laborers and service providers.
But that's just the clean, simple theory. The reality on the ground is the Jati model. In this model, each floor of that building has thousands of different apartments, or Jatis. Your daily life, your job, your marriage, who you can eat with, is defined by your Jati, which is a much more local and complex reality.
Where did the Varna model come from? The source mentions the divine origin theory from the Rig Veda's Purush Sukta hymn. It's a metaphor.
That Brahmins came from the mouth of the cosmic being, Kshatriyas from his arms, Vaishyas from thighs, and Shudras from feet.
There's also the Guna theory, which links Varnas to 3 basic human energies. Sattva is the energy of balance and knowledge for Brahmins.
Right.
Rajas is the energy of action and passion for Kshatriyas. And Tamas is the energy of inertia and material needs for Vaishyas and Shudras.
And the rules were very strict, especially for marriage. Anuloma, a higher caste man marrying a lower caste woman, was sometimes accepted. But Pratiloma, the reverse, was strictly prohibited.
Now the Jati model, the reality. The features are rigid, birth-based membership, strict endogamy, traditionally fixed occupations, rules about sharing food, और हर जाति की अपनी council या पंचायत होती थी to enforce these rules with an iron fist.
The system is often criticized for its demerits. It kills economic mobility, leads to exploitation, harms national unity, and creates untouchability. But were there any perceived merits? The only merits argued were that it provided a kind of social security within the community. A Jati functioned like a guild, protecting its members and preserving specific skills. But this security came at the massive cost of individual freedom and social justice.
So what's the biggest practical difference between Varna and Jati?
Varna is the 4-part all-India theoretical framework. Jati is the reality of thousands of local endogamous communities. Your actual social identity and daily life were governed by your Jati, not your Varna.
Why was Pratiloma marriage, a lower caste man and a higher caste woman, seen as such a huge violation?
It was all about maintaining the perceived purity of the hierarchy. The reverse marriage, Anuloma, was tolerated because the children often took the father's higher status. But Pratiloma was seen as a grave violation of the social and ritual order, polluting the higher Varna.
Let's talk about the food rules. Pukka and Kacha food. Why was this so important?
It was a daily, tangible marker of purity and pollution. Kucha food, boiled in water, was seen as easily polluted and could only be accepted from an equal or higher caste. Pukka food, fried in ghee, was considered purer and could be accepted from some lower castes too. It was a constant performance of hierarchy.
So was the system always this rigid?
Sources suggest that in the very early Vedic period, the Varna system might have been more flexible, perhaps based on aptitude. But over centuries, it crystallized into the rigid, birth-based Jati system, especially by the Gupta period.
Is caste only a Hindu phenomenon?
While its religious and theoretical roots are in Hinduism, the social structure has influenced other religious communities in India as well, including some sections of Muslims, Christians, and Sikhs. It became a social reality even where it wasn't a theoretical one.
Pause करके वर्णा मॉडल के 4 ग्रुप्स और उनकी origin story from Brahma को repeat करो. Practicing.
In short, the caste system is a rigid social hierarchy determined by birth, with the 4-fold Varna model as its ideal theory and the thousands of Jatis as its complex reality.
Topic 8. Purity and pollution.
The core logic.
Broad micro theme. The core principle of hierarchy. Purity and pollution. The logic of separation. So now let's get to the operating system of the caste system. The fundamental principle that makes it all work. The opposition between purity and pollution.
According to the scholar Louis Dumont, this binary opposition is the foundation of everything. The hierarchy exists to separate the pure from the impure. The division of labor is about segregating pure and impure occupations. It's the central logic.
So what makes something pure versus polluted?
Purity is associated with things like vegetarianism, teetotalism, and traditional rituals. Pollution is linked to death, bodily emissions, and occupations that deal with them, like leather work or cleaning. Certain foods, like meat, are considered more polluting than others.
And the caste rank depends on how close it is to these concepts.
Yes, this is the concept of relative ranking. A vegetarian caste will always rank higher than a non-vegetarian one. A caste that handles pure materials will rank higher than one that handles polluting ones.
But this isn't just an idea. It's performed in daily life. The source mentions Meckham Marriott's interactional theory.
Exactly. Marriott argued that caste ranking isn't static. It's actively performed and reinforced every day through the ritualized giving and receiving of food and ritual services.
Break that down. How does food exchange show rank?
It's a powerful social code. A caste that accepts food from another caste is implicitly acknowledging the giver's higher or equal rank. If I can accept food from you, but you cannot accept the same food from me, it means I am of a lower rank than you. This happened in every village every day.
And services.
With services, it's generally the reverse. Receiving a ritual service implies a higher status for the receiver. A Brahmin who performs a ritual for a family is the service provider, but he is of a higher rank. However, a barber or a washerman who provides services is ranked lower than the person they serve.
So these daily exchanges of food and services are like a constant, silent conversation that reinforces the hierarchy.
Precisely. It's a system of continuous performance that makes the abstract idea of purity and pollution a tangible, lived reality for everyone.
This directly leads to the concept of untouchability, doesn't it?
It is the logical, brutal extreme of this principle. The groups considered untouchable were those whose traditional occupations were deemed the most polluting. The pollution was considered so severe that even their physical touch, or sometimes even their shadow, was thought to defile a member of a higher caste.
How does modernization challenge this concept?
Modernization is a direct attack on this principle. In an anonymous city, on a public bus, or in a restaurant, it's physically impossible to maintain these strict separation rules. Education and secular law also challenge the very basis of this ideology.
So, can a rich person from a lower caste be considered pure?
This is a central tension in modern India. In the traditional system, ritual status, purity, was supreme. But today, economic and political power, secular status, are increasingly important. A wealthy Dalit may still face discrimination in a ritual or marriage context, but their economic power gives them a very different kind of status in the secular world. Ritual status and secular status are now often in conflict.
Practice this. Explain how food exchange determines caste rank. Practice saying it.
In short, the caste hierarchy is built on the fundamental principle of ritual purity versus pollution, a logic that governs social interactions, occupations, and status through daily performance.
Okay, broad micro theme. The lowest rung of the hierarchy.
Hmm.
Scheduled castes facing historical injustice. Let's now focus on the group most brutally affected by this system of purity and pollution. The term scheduled caste, or SC, first appeared in the Government of India Act 1935. Before that, they were called the depressed classes.
Gandhi called them Harijan, or children of God. However, many in the community today prefer the term Dalit, from Marathi, which means broken or oppressed. It's a term of self-chosen political identity and assertion.
The numbers are significant. SCs are about 16.7% of India's population. And the vast majority, around 84%, still live in rural areas, often as landless agricultural workers.
The core issue they faced was untouchability. This wasn't just a belief. It led to severe multi-generational social, economic, and educational problems.
Let's look at the social disabilities. The source lists some horrifying examples. They were historically barred from temples, public wells, and schools. They couldn't wear signs of prosperity like gold, and in some places were even denied services from barbers or washermen.
The social oppression led directly to economic deprivation. The general ban on land ownership created a cycle of poverty and dependence. This resulted in chronic indebtedness and forced labor, or bigar, where they had to work for little or no wages.
And naturally, this created extreme educational backwardness. With deep poverty and social restrictions, education was an impossible dream for most. Sending a child to school often meant losing a working hand for the family.
It was a vicious cycle. Social oppression led to economic exploitation, which in turn prevented educational upliftment, reinforcing the social oppression.
Where does the name scheduled caste come from?
It's a legal and administrative term. It literally means they are on a schedule or a list maintained by the government. The President of India is empowered by the Constitution to specify which castes are included in this schedule, making them eligible for protective measures.
So, has untouchability been eradicated now?
Legally and constitutionally, yes, it is abolished and is a crime. In urban public life, it's largely absent. However, social attitudes are slow to change. In many rural areas, subtle and sometimes overt forms of discrimination persist, especially around housing, marriage, and access to common resources.
And what about the economic situation?
There has been significant progress since independence, largely due to constitutional safeguards like reservations. A vocal and educated middle class has emerged from within the Dalit community. However, a vast number still face deep poverty and rely on manual labor.
When we talk about leaders who fought this system, One name stands above all others.
Without a doubt, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, a Dalit himself, he was a brilliant scholar who rose to become the architect of the Indian Constitution. He fought relentlessly for the rights, dignity, and empowerment of the scheduled castes, advocating for a path of education, political organization, and legal rights.
I want to go back to the term Dalit. Why is it preferred over Harijan?
Many feel that Harijan, while perhaps well-intentioned, is patronizing. It frames them as objects of pity. Dalit, on the other hand, is an assertive political identity. It acknowledges the history of oppression, but also signifies a powerful struggle for rights and dignity.
Let's practice. Name 3 major types of disabilities faced by scheduled castes. Practice saying them.
In short, scheduled caste or Dalits have faced a severe historical injustice rooted in untouchability, which created a vicious cycle of social, economic, and educational deprivation.
Topic 10.
Constitutional safeguards for scheduled caste.
Then response to the injustice.
Broad.
Micro-theme.
The legal framework for empowerment.
Constitutional safeguards, a promise of equality. The makers of the Indian Constitution, led by Dr. Ambedkar, were deeply aware of this historical injustice. So they didn't just promise equality, they built a powerful engine into the Constitution to achieve it.
This is one of the most remarkable aspects of the Indian Constitution. It's not just about passive rights, it's about active, state-led intervention to correct a historical wrong. It's a framework for social revolution.
Instead of listing all the articles, let's group them by what they do. It seems like the Constitution launched a 3-pronged attack. First, it made a direct assault on the core problem.
Yes, that's Article 17. It's simple and absolute. It abolishes untouchability in any form and makes its practice a punishable offense. It cuts out the very heart of the old system.
The second prong seems to be about creating opportunities, not just removing barriers. This is where reservation comes in.
Exactly. Article 15.4 allows the state to make special provisions for the advancement of SCs, and Article 16.4 specifically permits the reservation of jobs in government services. This is the constitutional basis for affirmative action. It recognizes that you can't have a fair race if some runners have been chained for centuries.
And the third prong is about ensuring political power and voice.
That's right. Articles 330 and 332 reserve seats for SCs in the parliament and state assemblies. This ensures that their voices are heard in the highest lawmaking bodies of the country, so they are not just subjects of law, but also its creators.
And to make sure all of this actually works, there's a watchdog body.
Yes, Article 338 provides for a National Commission for Scheduled Castes. It investigates complaints, monitors how safeguards are being implemented, and advises the government. It has the powers of a civil court.
Beyond the Constitution, there are also powerful laws like the SC/ST Prevention of Atrocities Act of 1989.
That act is crucial. It was created to prevent specific atrocities against SC and ST communities, like social boycotts or public humiliation, and it provides for special courts and the rehabilitation of victims.
Let's talk about reservation. What's the core argument for it? People often talk about merit.
The core argument is that merit is not something that exists in a vacuum. It's a product of opportunity, good schools, nutrition, social networks, and confidence, all of which was systematically denied to Dalits for centuries. Reservation isn't a charity. It's a tool for ensuring representation and correcting a deep historical disadvantage. It's about creating a level playing field.
And is reservation permanent?
Political reservations were initially for 10 years and are extended periodically. Reservations in jobs and education don't have a fixed time limit. The idea is that they are a temporary measure needed until these communities achieve social and economic parity with the rest of society.
Why doesn't Article 17 give a specific definition of untouchability?
That was a very clever and deliberate choice by the framers. They feared that if they defined it, people would find loopholes to practice it in ways not covered by the definition. By leaving it undefined, they gave the courts the power to interpret it broadly to cover any and every form of discrimination based on this practice.
How effective has this entire framework been in reality?
It's been a game changer, without a doubt. It has enabled millions from Dalit communities to access education, secure government jobs, and enter politics, leading to significant social and economic mobility. However, implementation on the ground is still a challenge, and social prejudices have not been completely erased. The revolution is ongoing.
Let's practice. Name the most important constitutional article that abolishes untouchability. Practice saying it.
In short, the Indian Constitution provides a robust framework of legal and political safeguards, including the abolition of untouchability and reservations to empower scheduled castes and remedy historical injustices.
Topic 11. Other backward classes, OBCs.
Okay.
Broad micro theme. The middle of the pyramid. Other backward classes, OBC. Identifying disadvantage. Now, the Constitution also recognizes a third massive group, the other backward classes, or OBCs. Who are they?
This is a very large and diverse category. They are communities that are considered socially and educationally backward, but were not subjected to untouchability like the scheduled castes. Many are small peasants, artisans, weavers, potters, groups whose traditional livelihoods were often disrupted by industrialization. They are caught in the middle of the social pyramid.
The real turning point for them was the Second Backward Classes Commission, popularly known as the Mandal Commission, appointed in 1978. What was its job?
Its main job was to define clear criteria to identify these backward classes across the country. It was a massive undertaking.
How did they do it? The source says they didn't just look at one thing.
No, they created a complex multi-point system. Think of it like a doctor's diagnosis. They didn't just check your temperature. They checked social health. Was the caste considered backward by others? Educational health. What were the school dropout rates? And economic health. What were their family assets? The key insight was that backwardness wasn't just about poverty. It was a deep-rooted, multi-dimensional problem.
And based on this diagnosis, what did they recommend?
They identified over 3,700 castes as backward. And their headline recommendation was a 27% reservation for OBCs in government jobs and educational institutions.
This was hugely controversial when the VP Singh government accepted it in 1990.
Yes, it led to massive protests, primarily from the upper castes. But in 1992, the Supreme Court upheld the decision with one very important condition: the exclusion of the creamy layer.
Okay, what exactly is the creamy layer?
This refers to the socio-economically advanced sections within the OBCs themselves. The idea is simple. The benefits of reservation should go to the most deserving and not be cornered by those who are already well off and empowered.
Who falls into this creamy layer?
The criteria are quite specific and are revised over time. It generally includes children of high-ranking government officers, professionals like doctors and lawyers with high incomes, or families with significant landholdings or annual income above a certain threshold.
And this creamy layer concept does not apply to SCs and STs.
That's correct. The Supreme Court has so far held that the creamy layer exclusion applies only to OBCs. The reasoning is that the stigma of untouchability for SCs is a separate and more severe disability that persists regardless of economic status.
So what is the main difference between the situation of SCs and OBCs?
The single biggest difference is the historical experience of untouchability. While OBCs faced social and educational backwardness and were low in the hierarchy, they were generally not considered untouchable or polluting in the way SCs were.
Has the 27% reservation made a difference for OBCs?
Yes, it has significantly increased the representation of OBCs in government jobs and higher education. Politically, it has been transformative, leading to the rise of many powerful OBC leaders and political parties who champion the cause of their communities.
Let's practice. What was the percentage of reservation recommended by the Mandal Commission for OBCs? Practice saying it.
In short, OBCs are a large group of socially and educationally backward classes who were granted 27% reservation based on the Mandal Commission's report, with the crucial exclusion of the creamy layer.
Bhag 3. Impact of religions on Indian society.
Final section.
Topic 12. Jainism. Broad micro-theme. The path of non-violence.
Right.
Jainism, the power of ahimsa. Now let's turn to how other major religions have influenced this complex Indian society. We start with Jainism.
Jainism's greatest contribution to India's ethical DNA is its core tenet of ahimsa, or non-violence. And this isn't just a passive idea, it's a radical commitment to not harming any form of life. This led to the practice of strict vegetarianism.
And this one idea had a massive ripple effect, right?
Profound impact. It deeply influenced Indian thought across the board and was a major inspiration for leaders like Mahatma Gandhi. Jainism also gave an ethical code for life, the Anuvratas, or vows, Satya, truth, Asteya, non-stealing, Brahmacharya, chastity, and Aparigraha, non-possession.
How did it challenge the existing social order of its time?
It offered a path to salvation based on ethical conduct and self-control, not on elaborate rituals or caste hierarchy. This made liberation accessible to everyone, regardless of their birth, which was a direct challenge to orthodox Brahmanism.
Who was the main figure who popularized these teachings?
While Jainism has a lineage of 24 Tirthankaras, the last and most influential was Mahavira, a contemporary of the Buddha. He was instrumental in consolidating and propagating these doctrines.
Why did Jainism become particularly popular among the merchant and trading communities?
The strong emphasis on honesty, satya, and non-stealing, asteya, resonated deeply with the business community. Also, their profession did not involve agriculture, which can accidentally harm insects and small animals, making it easier for them to practice ahimsa strictly.
Okay, practice saying the central tenet of Jainism, practicing ahimsa.
In short, Jainism's primary impact on Indian society came from its radical and profound emphasis on ahimsa, non-violence, which shaped the country's ethical and moral fabric.
Topic 30. Buddhism.
Okay.
Broad microtheme. The middle path to enlightenment. Buddhism, equality and humanism. Next, Buddhism, which also emerged around the 6th century BCE and gave a powerful jolt to the established order.
If Jainism's keyword was ahimsa, Buddhism's was equality. It launched a direct attack on the caste system by rejecting rituals and preaching total equality. The Buddha taught that a person's worth comes from their actions, karma, not their birth, jati.
It also emphasized humanism, right? The idea that you are your own savior.
Absolutely. The core teaching is that man is the architect of his own destiny. You achieve enlightenment through your own efforts and understanding, not by praying to an external god. This was incredibly empowering.
And their contribution to education was revolutionary. They established some of the world's first great universities like Nalanda and Takshila, which were magnets for scholars from all over Asia.
And also promoted the use of vernacular languages like Pali instead of the elite Sanskrit. This made religion and knowledge accessible to the common person for the first time.
And Buddhism's influence is literally written into India's national identity today.
Yes, the Ashoka wheel in the center of the Indian flag and the national emblem of the four lions are both adopted from the legacy of the great Buddhist emperor Ashoka, who became the religion's greatest patron.
How is Buddhism's rejection of caste different from Jainism's?
Both challenged the system, but Buddhism's rejection was arguably more direct and socially widespread. The Buddha actively welcomed people from all castes, including the lowest, into the Sangha or monastic order, creating a community where caste distinctions were explicitly erased.
Why did Buddhism eventually decline in India, the land of his birth?
It's a complex question. Historians point to a combination of factors: a strong revival of Hinduism, the loss of royal patronage after emperors like Ashoka, internal corruption in the monasteries, and finally, the devastating invasions from Central Asia that destroyed major Buddhist centers like Nalanda.
How did Ashoka help spread Buddhism so far and wide?
After the bloody Kalinga War, a remorseful emperor Ashoka converted to Buddhism. He then used the entire machinery of his vast empire to spread its message of peace and dharma. He sent missionaries across Asia, built thousands of stupas, and inscribed Buddhist teachings on pillars and rocks for everyone to see.
Let's practice. Name one of the ancient universities established by Buddhists. Practice saying Nalanda.
In short, Buddhism fundamentally challenged the caste system by promoting equality and humanism and made lasting contributions to Indian education, democracy, and national symbols.
Right.
Topic 14. Islam.
Broad micro-theme, the message of brotherhood. Islam, monotheism and cultural synthesis. The arrival of Islam in India, starting around the 7th century AD, introduced a completely new set of ideas and cultural streams.
Its most powerful theological idea was radical monotheism, the belief in one God. This had a profound social implication. If there is one God, then all human beings are equal before him. This message of universal brotherhood was a direct ideological challenge to the hierarchical caste system.
And a very important phase of Islam in India was Sufism.
Yes, the Sufi saints were mystics who preached a message of love, devotion, and sul-e-kul, peace for all. Their shrines became spiritual centers for people of all faiths, providing a refuge for the oppressed and fostering a beautiful synthesis of Hindu and Islamic ideas.
This led to syncretism, right?
Yes, the blending of cultures. Civilization. You see it in everything. In language, the birth of Urdu, a mix of Persian, Arabic, and local Indian languages. In music, the introduction of the ghazal and qawwali. In architecture, the iconic arches, domes, and minarets.
Even in modern social laws, Islam had an influence.
Yes, it introduced new concepts regarding divorce and property rights for women that were different from the existing systems.
What's the main difference between the Bhakti movement in Hinduism and Sufism in Islam? They seem so similar.
They are incredibly similar in their emphasis on love, devotion, and a personal connection to God, and they deeply influenced each other. The key difference is their origin. Bhakti is rooted in Hindu traditions, while Sufism is the mystical branch of Islam. Both served as powerful challenges to religious orthodoxy and brought religion to the common people.
We often hear about conflict, but it seems there was a lot of synthesis as well.
The history is complex. There were periods of conflict and destruction, for sure. But there were also long periods of peaceful coexistence, mutual admiration, and incredible cultural fusion. Both are part of the story.
How did the Unani system of medicine develop in India?
It originated in ancient Greece and was refined by Arab and Persian physicians. It was introduced to India during the medieval period and became a popular system of medicine, integrating with local Ayurvedic knowledge and practices. It's another great example of synthesis.
Okay, let's practice. Name a musical form that became popular in India due to Islamic influence. Practice saying Qawwali.
In short, Islam introduced the concept of social equality and contributed immensely to a syncretic Indian culture through Sufism, art, architecture, music, and language.
Topic 15. Christianity.
And the final one?
Broad micro-theme, modernization and social service. Christianity, service and education. Finally, let's talk about Christianity. While it has a very ancient history in India, its influence grew significantly during the colonial period.
Christianity acted as a major agent of modernization in Indian society. The key vehicles for this were the social services provided by Christian missionaries, especially in two areas, education and healthcare.
They established schools, colleges, and hospitals across the country, many of which remain India's leading institutions even today. And they often did this in remote and isolated regions, among tribal and untouchable populations who were neglected by everyone else.
This focus on modern education, open to all, had a transformative effect. It also served as a direct attack on the evils of the caste system. By offering education and dignity to the most marginalized, and by preaching a message of universal brotherhood, it contributed to the formation of a more egalitarian society.
So the core impact was through this model of seva or service.
Yes, the source highlights this relentless focus on service to the underprivileged as a key contribution. This set a new benchmark for social work and philanthropy in India.
When did Christianity first arrive in India? It wasn't with the British, right?
Not at all. Tradition holds that it arrived in the 1st century AD with the apostle St. Thomas, who is believed to have landed in Kerala. So Christianity in India is almost as old as the religion itself.
How did the missionaries' work impact the people they served, especially Dalits and tribals?
For many of them, conversion to Christianity was seen as a path to escape the oppressive caste system. It gave them access to education, healthcare, and a sense of dignity and self-worth that had been denied to them for centuries.
Did this lead to social tensions?
The issue of religious conversion has been a source of social and political tension at times. Critics have often accused missionaries of using social services as a tool for proselytization. It remains a sensitive and debated topic.
Beyond education and healthcare, were there other contributions?
Yes, they played a huge role in the development of print technology and journalism in many regional languages. They were also pioneers in linguistics, documenting and creating grammars for many local languages for the first time.
Let's practice. Name the two main areas of social service focused on by Christian missionaries. Practice saying education and healthcare.
In short, Christianity's major impact on Indian society has been as an agent of modernization, primarily through its extensive and pioneering contributions to education, healthcare, and social service, particularly among marginalized communities.
Wow, what an incredibly deep and wide-ranging discussion. हमने इंडियन सोशल सिस्टम की पूरी जर्नी को देखा. चलो, एक फाइनल क्विक रिकैप करते हैं.
बिल्कुल.
Broad micro theme 1, traditional basis of Indian social system.
हमने समझा कि पुरुषार्था and the ashma system provided a blueprint for a balanced life.
We saw how the concepts of karma and punarjanam created a framework of moral accountability, and how Rina instilled a sense of social duty.
और हमने joint family को India's original social insurance system जाना.
Broad micro theme 2, the caste system and social stratification.
हमने वर्ना the ideal theory और जाति the complex reality के बीच का difference समझा.
We understood that the entire system was built on the logic of purity and pollution.
And we discussed the historical challenges faced by scheduled castes and OBCs and the constitutional safeguards created to empower them.
Broad micro theme 3, impact of religions on Indian society.
फाइनली हमने देखा कि कैसे जैनिज्म ने अहिंसा का मंत्र दिया, बुद्धिज्म ने इक्वालिटी का, इस्लाम ने ब्रदरहुड और एक रिच सिंक्रेटिक कल्चर का, और क्रिश्चियनिटी ने एजुकेशन और सोशल सर्विस का मॉडल दिया.
Fantastic recap. अब लिसनर के लिए here are 6 content probes. इनके बारे में सोचना.
Number 1, in today's hyper-individualistic world, what could be a modern interpretation of dharma?
2, what have we gained and what have we lost with the decline of the traditional joint family?
3, what do you think is the biggest reason the caste system has survived for so long?
4, is reservation a tool for equality of opportunity or equality of outcome?
5, why were movements like Sufism and Bhakti so successful in connecting with the common people?
And 6, how did the introduction of modern education challenge the traditional social structures in India?
और अब आपके लिए एक छोटा सा चैलेंज. इनमें से किसी एक टॉपिक को, फॉर एग्जाम्पल द कॉन्सेप्ट ऑफ कर्मा, चूज करो और उसको अपने किसी फ्रेंड या फैमिली मेंबर को 5 मिनट में समझाने की कोशिश करो. देखो इफ यू कैन एक्सप्लेन इट्स डीपर मीनिंग बियॉन्ड जस्ट व्हाट गोज अराउंड कम्स अराउंड.
परफेक्ट. यही था आज का सफर इंडियन सोसाइटी की गहराइयों में. वी होप आपको मजा आया और आपने बहुत कुछ नया सीखा. ऐसे ही अमेजिंग कंटेंट के लिए मेक श्योर यू सब्सक्राइब, लाइक और कमेंट करके हमें बताओ कि आपको सबसे इंटरेस्टिंग क्या लगा. हम मिलेंगे अगली बार एक और टॉपिक के साथ. तब तक के लिए सोचते रहिए, सीखते रहिए.